So, Stephen, good morning to you. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for chatting with me. So, we're here to chat about many things, including your book. But I want to start by asking what you think might be going on in the global human psyche if we play with that frame.
What, right off the bat, just like
Right off the bat.
the most yeah, like describe all of humanity's like mental state
Yeah,
at this moment, like that kind of
go
thing.
for it. From your own, node in our ecosystem, what's going on, do you think?
I mean, like daily abject terror, mixed in with a little, perseverance, persistence, and hope,
Do
like that kind of thing. Probably the state humanity's been in most of its existence.
you think? Do you think there's like a climactic moment of greater abject terror than normal, or do you think it's like, well, it's just one of many similar peaks?
I don't know. I've only been alive for this one. But I think like, for me, I'm always trying to have a little fun and maintain like some sense of joy in the midst of doing a lot of work around some really like horrifying existential issues. So I feel like that's how most people have to learn to cope with it,
Yeah.
or have whiskey at 10 a.m. That's the other quick quick
Thanks for
solve.
outing me. Well, I mean, you're
Yeah.
not. It's 10 a.m. where you are. It's what time is it where I am? 7:03.
It's a whiskey
So do you think
appropriate time. Yeah.
I never drink on the show, but it's been such an intense life in a
No.
joyful,
Yeah.
non-war torn country way. So first world problems. But I've just finished, as I mentioned before we came on recording my third album, which has been extraordinarily joyful and really fucking intense. So,
Yeah.
why not? But
Congratulations.
let's,
Yeah.
thank you. But maybe actually, let's start from what you just pointed to, which is that in the work that you're doing with all of the terror and the heartbreak and intensity of what we're facing, what is it that gives you joy and hope? How do you keep yourself? I mean, you're smiling as we're talking. How?
Well, I think like a general state of denial was always helpful. Just like sort of whistling through the graveyard kind of thing. No, I think, look, I've said this before and I will stand by it. I think when I'm constantly like jacked into the situation and I'm like reading about ocean temperatures and how terrifyingly warm the ocean is right now and all the ramifications of that, from the tiny little creatures we need to maintain the food web of our oceans to coastal real estate. I'm like, oh my god, we are in so much trouble, right?
Yeah.
And yet, this massive problem has been left for us, and I do think there's something powerful about being alive in a time when one's actions as a citizen, and as sort of a little node in history, will matter so much for the human future. And I think to some extent we have to all embrace that and serve our role. And that is sort of how I constructed in my head to get me through the day.
So one of the things that I was thinking about, well, and still haven't finished your remarkable book, and it is a remarkable book, The Deluge. But one of the things that has struck me while reading it, well, there's several. One is like how you can dream yourself into so many different lives because they're so vivid, all of these different characters and voices, these vignettes into people's realities. So that's one question. And another question is, as someone who's created something, and this is not your only book, but something that's extraordinarily complex to create and requires huge amounts of perseverance and intellect and passion and determination. And that has a huge impact. I mean, you've been all kinds of TV shows and the rest of it. For those of us who are not in those shoes on your path, I think one of the questions can be, what part could I possibly play? If someone's struggling with their, family or trying to hold down a job, which we all have in different like variations, what role is too small? How do people move themselves out of this paralytic sense of helplessness, lack of agency, of tininess and finitude in the face of the scale of the problem that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I mean, I I recommend undergoing a 12-year intellectual journey through the climate crisis to create a War and Peace sized tome of the situation. That's
I mean, you did
helped
start in
me.
2010, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. No, and I mean, when I was writing the book, my I got to a place where I'd set in motion all of these crises and things that I had written into the book would then come true in real life, and it was really like a frightening way to like try to talk or think about the future. Is that these plot points you're concocting are suddenly like outdated because it's all happened, and therefore you have to
That's
escalate
terrifying.
you have to escalate the plot points in order so that it doesn't just read as if something's already happened, right? Um, but at the end of the novel, after I'd set all these crises in motion, I sort of went about the book's ending, which is okay, if all of this were to actually happen, what would we do about it? What would our governments do about it? How would society react? Right. And at that point, I sort of embarked upon talking to everybody who works in all of these fields, everything from like, the economics of solar farms to, people who work on managed retreat from the coasts, right?
Hmm.
And when you do that, you get this sense of, all these boring people working and dedicating their lives to solving every facet, every little, niche of this problem, right? Um, and I do think that when people just approach climate from the space of like, oh my God, this is a terrifying situation, all these disasters, we're all doomed. It is
Hmm.
paralyzing. And it's really important that people within the movement don't wallow in that piece of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
not to ignore it and not to sort of sugarcoat it, but to not sit and throw up our hands and allow despair to be our primary operating principle. When you do go out and start looking at everybody who works on this issue and is trying to think through the solutions to it, you get this sense of an incredible rising army, right? Like we are all part of an emerging historical movement that, if successful, is going to accomplish something absolutely incredible. And the odds are certainly stacked against us, but that's okay. And I think like thinking through the issues with that kind of sense of determination and resilience is really the key to like not just to solving this, but to sort of protecting our own emotional well-being in the process.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like talking about like protecting our own emotional well-being. One of the things that crops up a lot in conversations between friends and on here as well is kind of the idea of an orientation towards some form of equilibrium, and that this is rarely a resting place that you get to stay for too long. You're like either on one side or the other, whether it's, spending time being aware of what's going on in the world, being open to news before you realize that it's having too much of an impact on your ability to concentrate and focus and move the needle on the things that you care
Yeah.
about, like whatever it is. So it's also that I think there's my sense, and I'm very curious to hear your take on this, especially within Western cultures, which are oriented towards individualism and one's own personal, isolated, atomized sense of self-reliance,
Totally.
resilience, etc. Like, what are you seeing? I'm going to put it as a question. What are you seeing as the greatest untapped sources of power to help us feel connected, to help us feel able to cope with some of the harder stuff?
Well, um, I mean, I always think it's like, let's go back to basics. And it is that sense of community, an actual community,
Mm.
not online community. But being together with people face to face, talking through these issues and trying to work towards useful, a useful response to it. I was at
Mm-hmm.
a conference in Idaho with a whole variety of people who work around climate. And I just had such a great time, not just discussing sort of these issues, but just being around intelligent, dedicated folks working on every little niche of this problem, right? And when you start jamming all this creativity and all of these big brains into a room, not my big brain, but like other people's big brains. I was just there to listen. Uh, you get this sense of like, oh man, like we have so many people from so many different walks of life coming together to think through how to reverse what's happening, right?
Mm.
And that gives you an incredible amount of hope about everything. I think where we all go wrong and a piece of our current like sort of the way our discourse has been set up or like commodified is social media and surveillance capitalism and what that has done to our sense of community and our sense of purpose. All of this stuff, as far as I'm concerned, is pure poison. And it is really thrown a wrench into our ability to respond, even as Western democracies, even as places where, we do have a free discourse, but that discourse has been hijacked by a bunch of Silicon Valley companies that, have no interest in a good debate around anything, but just want to make us all angry and anxious and addicted to our devices and their really disgusting platforms. But I am on Instagram, so if anybody wants to follow me, smash those likes.
What's your handle, Stephen?
It's just my name. I'm quite a hypocrite. So,
there's so many. I've got so many questions here as well. But as we're talking about social media, and about ways in which, because social media tells us stories that we find at some level irresistible, right? And I think as an author, as someone who uses your imagination rooted to fact, rooted to possibilities of where we could go as a species with all the other species, there's a really important aspect about how we relate to creativity in all of its forms in order to open up vistas that we have yet to imagine, that are not predetermined, that could lead to a much more flourishing future for all of life. So in your wildest dreams, what do you imagine happening now that we could do to create a future that is possible? It doesn't have to be a utopia. Maybe you're thinking about like Manda Scott's work and others, a throughtopia where there is a concerted effort where people's lives are dignified and we don't have to have as many mod cons as we have. Like, what do you see as possible and wildly exciting in a future we could create together?
No, absolutely. And I mean, that is exactly the project of the Deluge. It is not a utopia. It's not a dystopia, though it gets that label sometimes. It really is a thought experiment, a literary thought experiment about how we're going to get out of this really, really frightening and dangerous moment in human history, right? And without spoiling, the book takes very seriously that we're already past the point of, we'll do this and that, and then we'll have our brilliant neoliberal utopia, right? It's like, no, that's not on the table. We're not getting that. So now we have to fight for, a livable future, but also hopefully a future that is more just, equitable, prosperous on all the rest, right? And I think like, because we're bombarded with like the really horrifying stuff going on in the world all the time, we sometimes miss the green shoots and all of the really incredible, developments that are happening that point in a different direction. Just to start with this example, it's the prices of solar and wind power generation or electricity have fallen so rapidly in the last few years that it's really changed the trajectory of where we're going. Like this, the clean energy revolution is happening. It's just a matter of how quickly. Like this stuff is going to win the day. It's just a matter of how fast, right? And yes, when you get into like looking at replacing our entire industrial society with clean energy, you start to think about, okay, what about these minerals? What about land use, et cetera, et cetera? But without question, when you do the math, this future is so much cleaner, healthier, better than any one with fossil fuels that it's not even funny, right? And what I think like focusing our attention on the climate crisis is doing is it's instilling an ecological principle into our politics very subtly. Like people who work on clean energy are having to think through mineral use and land use and all the rest, our interaction with other species, our interactions with ecosystems. And we have to remember that in terms of like behaving as if this planet was the only one we will ever have, which it is.
Right.
We only really started to think about this, 100 years ago, basically. You know what I mean? Like thinking through what we call environmentalism is a brand new thing in the human experience, almost, to a certain degree. And, I think as we move forward, we're going to become, at least if our politics can allow for it, we're going to become a more determined species about protecting this place after giving it a near-death experience, right? Like that, I think is what we're going to have to look for. So, I'm also like, I'm really, really convinced that like the resiliency of nature and the resiliency of sort of human beings in the face of having to do the right thing is going to prove more impressive than people realize right now.
I love your optimism. I think you're right. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking of the other day, listening to people in conversation, was the fact that everything that exists now, all of the biodiversity, has basically made it through 5 mass extinctions, where there's been bottlenecks, where, I don't know if it's something, estimates between 93 and 97% of all life has been extinguished various times. And so there is the possibility that we could help to regenerate or steward the regeneration of vast tracts of life forms, etc., and land. The question is whether we make it through.
Yeah.
And also the other thing, which is touched upon in your book, which was extraordinarily well researched. I don't know how you have the capacity for it, but is our relationship with technology. And so I'm curious, having researched the book and having seen how quickly technological advances have dominated public discourse, especially in the last 12 to sort of 18 months. What are you most excited about? And what do you think are kind of the danger zones in terms of hype with our current fascination with perhaps obsession with technology, in particular AI, and its capacity to help, quote unquote, solve major problems, which it may be. I mean, like, what do you think?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, if you've read the book, you noticed there is a lot about AI in there that sort of exists under the radar. And when I first turned this book in to a few friends and my editor, Simon Schuster, I remember getting some notes like, this AI stuff is a little out there, like a computer writing a news story. Like, come on, like there's no way. And cut to 3 years later. And again, like something I've written is just coming true in the world, right? It's.
Do you think you're like the reincarnation of Nostradamus, just a bit more accurate?
But it's I liked it. I wish I could take credit for being so fucking perceptive. Sorry, I don't know if we can cuss on this.
Yeah, you can totally cuss.
I wish I could take credit, but it's like the only thing I ever did with the Deluge was look at exactly the tea leaves of like what are the trends in all of these areas, right? What are the trends with rising heat in the oceans? What are the trends with artificial intelligence, et cetera, et cetera? And you extrapolate, right? And the problem with AI is, in my opinion, not that it's going to, turn into Skynet and like blot out the sun and pump our bodies for energy or anything like that. Although, that might happen. I mean, sure, it's not totally out of the realm. But the real problem is that it's an authoritarian tool, right? Yeah. So in the West, it's being developed to create profit. And how will that profit be rolled out? Well, I mean, my guess is look at what surveillance capitalism has already done. It's going to track us and like learn our psychology and try to sell us shit. And in the meantime, make us anxious and sad and pissed off, et cetera, et cetera. And, when I look at like ChatGPT, it's like, this is doing is plagiarizing a host of human writers like myself. My novel Ohio was, found in the the large language model.
Seriously?
And so it's so a bunch of authors' novels were found in there. I think The Atlantic has a story about it. And it's outrageous. It's totally outrageous. And there's a lawsuit. And I obviously hope I, never have to work again by winning an incredible amount of money from this miserable company. But yeah, it's just another sort of example of like, we're going to launch into like a technology that's, extractive and probably really damaging. And it's going to further the epistemic crisis of like, wait a minute, how do we actually know that what this thing on the internet is saying is true, right? It claims it went out and scraped a whole bunch of, websites and deliver to us the truth about climate change. But it says the truth is that it's nothing to worry about and that carbon dioxide is good for plants, right?
Yeah.
Like these are the things where it's, you know, where the work of journalists has been so the work of journalists, the work of scientists, essayists, the work of great novelists has been, you know, sort of debased and disregarded by a class of people who view sort of you know, human intellectual curiosity and the search for meaning and truth as like a data point to be shoved into some big machine that they can then extract profit from. And that's to say nothing. That's just like my worries about what's happening here. I think why is the Chinese Communist Party developing an AI? It's to like basically meld the party with the AI and create an authoritarian structure that will be impermeable to reform or revolution, right? Like these are the things that are going to entice people about AI. And I think it's telling that doesn't get into the discourse, that part of it is not as talked about, is the minor ways in which it's going to intrude upon our lives and you know, sort of carry on trends we're already seeing. And that's not to say it couldn't be useful for discovering new materials or like, you know, figuring out how to detect pancreatic cancer earlier. I acknowledge I don't know enough about it. All those things might be true, but again, you look at the trends of what's happening with the early large language models, and you're like, well, this is like pretty apparent what's going to happen with this. So.
And I think especially, I mean, I think often people start with a question around technology itself, and which is an interesting place to start. It's like, what can we use this for? But if you roll it back and you think, okay, who's wielding it? Who's developing it? What's the psychology of people who have the power and the resources to actually develop these things? And what are they most likely, historically, going to use these things to leverage or increase or what diminish, like whatever? The equation often remains the same to the extent that when we see a trend that kind of bucks our expectations, like for instance, Polis in Taiwan, where Audrey Tang revolutionized social media in a way as to seek coherence and collaboration over specific points, which is almost like it's like the antidote to Twitter, let's say, but within political context. That becomes such a remarkable case or case study that people talk about it because it's so unlike what we've seen historically elsewhere. Like it's very unusual to find things put to a power that is distributed among people to empower folks to come together as citizens. But it doesn't mean that it's not possible because we've got examples.
For sure.
Yeah. And so I wonder, what do you think is the role or are some of the roles of culture in forming how we relate to what's possible and what's not? Because obviously in the US, you guys have got an election coming up. In the UK, we just had an election.
I hadn't heard. Wait, what? There's
what?
Nobody had met. I hadn't. Oh man, I should tune in. That's,
like really?
I wonder who's running.
I mean, what are your hopes, given all of your kind of, you know, all of your work and your historical tendencies to look through time and see what the prevalent trends are? Where are you at on that one?
On which one? The use of culture or the election? I forget that.
Oh God, I mean, whichever one. I feel like I have so many questions for you. They're probably all going to come out in a stream of consciousness. But whichever you find more interesting a question to pick.
Well, I spent 12 years writing a novel about climate and the political ramifications of it, the social ramifications of it, right? So I've done a lot of thinking around all of this, and the fact that it all, again, basically has adhered to my imagination, reality has adhered to my imagination, is not encouraging for me right now. But I will say that I think that the reason you spend 12 years writing a book like this, and as somebody who obviously cares passionately about the subject, I would often sort of think to myself, like, is this the best use of your time? Should I be out there, you know, working for a campaign or gluing myself to paintings or, you know, throwing paint on an oil executive, you know, whatever it might be. But I do think one of the projects of the Deluge is to give people a way to emotionally understand what is happening and therefore activate them into action, into a changed sensibility around these very, very difficult and scary issues. And so it will always be somebody who obviously stands on the side of like human created art, particularly literature, has the power to do things that nothing else in human society can, right? Like it has the power to put a person into a psychological state different from their own, to walk in somebody else's shoes and to think through the complexity of situations and issues and histories that they never would have imagined before. That's its magic trick. And so I, have sort of obviously 12 years later, 14 years later now, said to myself, like, okay, how do I move forward? How do I keep using this skill I have and this one talent? I'm not good at anything else. This one talent in order to create in other people the emotional experience that I've had with it.
So thinking a bit more about the Deluge, then, like it's been compared to many greats' work, but one of the pieces that I read, which was really interesting in researching this conversation, was that it was connected to 1984, which I remember reading very young, and it left a lasting impression, mostly because of the detail to actually things like beauty, like the glass paperweight that the key character finds. And in your book, there are so many moments where there's something about, whether it's like the relationship or a fleeting moment, or there's so many points of beauty and joy and meaning and connection. And I wonder, what's your take on how to move people through literature or through other means to a place of hope, and what you see as the kind of the motivating forces between hope and fear? Like, do we need both to move people to action? Because your book is replete with both. I mean, it spans so many different layers of the human experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that obviously intentional. Sometimes climate fiction or environmental fiction really, it wallows in, it's why post-apocalypticism is so popular. It's why, sort of end of the world dystopian literature is so popular, because it can sit in one sort of framework of human experience and just milk it the entire time. But obviously, even in the midst of catastrophe, some of us are still cracking jokes. Some of us are, we're all out there still being human, which means, we're having fun in the midst of it. We're hooking up. We're drinking too much. We're out late on a Saturday night in the middle of this really terrifying time, right? And so the Deluge, it's like you're obviously trying to create characters that feel realistic. And to me, that's always finding, the flaws in the heroes and the heroic moments of the monsters. It's painting somebody with that fully embodied, full scope, full brush of their humanness. And I think when you get to the specificity of a character, they become so much more real than all the archetypes, we sometimes think, that are fit in as characters in other stuff. And just, if you get the specificity of a person, they become real and they become more emotionally resonant to the reader. And that's sort of my philosophy, is you find all that by creating characters that almost feel as if they're sitting beside you and speaking into your ear.
And there's something about the universality being found in the minutiae and the differences that are particular to specific characters. I think the other thing that I found really, and this actually is in the first chapter of the book, that I found really compelling about your book, is the way in which it animates science. Like, science often is thought of as such a dry, inaccessible field. And so one of the biggest issues is, how do we bring these facts and figures to life? Because it's one way of understanding that which underpins all of the possibilities to go out and get drunk and hang out with friends and, all of this stuff. It's interlaced. It's one perspective on this extraordinary, beautiful, horrendous, joyful life that we're living. And so what are the ways in which you think are most powerful to animate science? I mean, obviously you do it in your book, but for those people who are listening, who are thinking, well, what can I learn about the techniques for this, who are activists perhaps, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of like the trickiest parts of climate as a social issue, which is that it is so technocrat. It's so technical. It's so like it requires such a like high level of understanding. It's not as clear cut as just this like typical like people are oppressed. We have to stop this oppression. Execute
Right.
social movement. Right. It actually like requires like a level of like engagement with some really heady subject matter that I have been doing nothing but reading about this issue for now 20-25 years, and I still will learn stuff that I'm like, whoa, okay, never knew that before. And yeah, and I think like that is sort of the first part of the journey is just engaging is if you're looking to, I mean, probably your viewers already have, or your listeners already have, but just understanding what is going on and not, um, reading a book, not just going to YouTube and asking like, what is climate change, but like reading a book on the subject, how helpful to get one's mind around what must be done. Right. And then the second thing I was going to say to that, I have forgotten. So next question.
So one of the questions I was actually going to ask you at the top of the conversation, but then we moved into a different direction because it was just too interesting not to, was actually what moved you to write the book. Because no one undertakes such a big work and commits over 2 decades of their life without profoundly loving something. So maybe let's start there. Like, what do you most profoundly love, and how did that express itself in the work? Choosing to write the book and the others that you've written.
I mean, I'm probably driven by two threads, which is sort of like the empathetic, magnanimous, like I want to leave the world a better place than I found it. That's one thread of wanting to write the book. The other is just pure ego and like, how can I become a super celebrated novelist who gets interviewed and gets to go on talk shows? How do I do that?
Well, tick.
No, it's no,
was it seriously? I mean, that's not like, it's important to include in the conversation. It's also human like everything else, no?
Yeah, nobody's writing a 1,000-page book and being like, nah, my ego's in check. It's fine. Like, I don't need to work on that. That's no. And so I think like as a young person, I was like very interested in everything political, scientific. I just had like a sort of a big, hungry attitude about the world and my engagement with it, right? And in college, I just sort of kept coming back to climate as like, oh, this is not just another issue. This is the thing that's going to define your entire life and most of the people on this planet's lives going forward, right? And I just saw that like slightly earlier than a lot of other people, like not even because obviously climate had been on the agenda for decades at that point, but I just saw it as like, this is it. This is the thing that's going to define my future and all of our futures. And then selfishly, as somebody who wanted to be an artist, who wanted to be an author, I was like, oh, great. Look at this enormous catastrophic issue. How do I build a narrative out of this? How do I make a kick-ass fucking awesome, can't put it down, epic about this epic problem? And from there, for years and years, my brain is just like doing the Rubik's Cube thing, trying to think through who are the people that populate this world. What is the structure? How are we going to move from like our known reality into the near future? What are all those techniques? What are those mechanisms? And, like any writer, you're constantly turning that over in your head and employing ideas and discarding them and bringing back ideas and just sort of playing in the sandbox nonstop with it.
What were some of the most shocking revelations that you encountered, revelations to you when you were doing this research?
I think
just don't like that question, but like, I'm so intrigued.
I mean, just generally, I think once you dive into the seriousness of it, it does start to get a little like stare at the ceiling at 4 a.m. Kind of, and just to say that like the book opens with this chapter about methane hydrates, about the methane that rings the world's oceans, and that if it were to melt, would basically fry civilization in relatively short order, right? And that's just like one of many tail risks that we're looking at with this with this situation where, oh, like if this gets out of control, it could really get out of control. And not in the way, and even if it doesn't, one of those big tipping points isn't reached, we're still looking at like this incredibly difficult time where we're going to have to muddle through some very challenging situations. Some, not just weather catastrophes, the destruction of ecosystems, but again, like how our politics will develop, how we will react to it as humans, what will happen to our social cohesion, what will happen to our economy. And when you have to think through all of those different issues all the time, in the shower, brushing your teeth, every day you sit down to work, it bears a psychological toll. It just has to. So I think that was, one of the challenges of writing the novel. And now that I've been sort of thrust into speaking more publicly about it, balancing that and being able to like sort of talk about it with some intelligence, hopefully, and not sort of slip into despair and doom. That's also a challenge. So, yeah.
So what is it that, I mean, this is usually one of my later questions, but bring it in now. Like, how do you orient yourself towards life and beauty and hope when everything is just overwhelmingly painful?
Well, I think the first thing I've done, and I don't do many smart things in my life, but in the last 4 years,
you're so self-deprecating. You should be British.
I'm also such a goof, if you couldn't tell. Like, I wrote this super serious novel, and everybody who knows me is like, I can't believe you're the person who wrote this.
It's perfect.
No, I've really gone on a serious information diet of what I'm taking in. Like, I deleted Twitter. I deleted most social media. I don't check the news every day. I read it very slowly and intentionally, where I'm not like glancing at headlines. I'm opening real stories by real journalists that have fact checkers behind them. And I am reading the complete, sort of reported journalism on the issue. I'm reading books even more than I used to. Like, I'm turning to that as like, always a heavy reader, but just making sure if I want to understand a subject, I'm like engaging with it seriously rather than frivolously. And then I'm a big basketball fan, so I just like pump nonstop NBA news into my head all the time and pretend like nothing else is happening in the world besides LeBron James' son coming to play with him on the Lakers. That keeps me even keeled.
Amazing.
Yeah.
But I think there's also, I mean, there is something, and you mentioned this earlier, like the kind of the frivolity. And I think there's something so powerful about the frivolity also of the human experiences. Let's say, like, just it's really important not to lose sight of play and stupidness. And I think ego is also important, especially I know a lot of people who are in the psychedelic space. And I meet, well, thankfully not so much anymore, but people who are like, oh, I have no ego. I'm like, dude, if you had no ego, we wouldn't be, in a conversation that would be, and they aren't remotely interesting conversations, they're quite tedious. But there are all of these things that you kind of have to integrate. So I wonder what's next then?
Nothing more annoying than, I was just going to say, nothing more annoying than the, like, I'm totally enlightened because I took acid a couple times. Like, that's
oh my God.
Yeah,
it's like chuffing your latest psychedelic brew. It just really gets on my tits. But, hey ho, each to their own. So what are some of the ways in which you imagine your life unfolding? Because obviously you're now speaking about a lot of the themes in the book. The book is extraordinary. It is also an epic, which means that a lot of people will feel quite shy about approaching it. But your work isn't simply kind of this author role. It's also communicator. You're moving people to take action. You're speaking a lot more. You're talking to people like me. What are the things that you see happening in the next few years for you in communicating some of the themes that other people might not reach if they're not big readers?
I mean, I was being kind of flip with the last answer, but I like what I like primarily am and remain and always want to keep first in my life is just my writing. I'm working on a new collection of short stories right now that has nothing to do with climate, which is a relief. And just like waking up every day and drinking my coffee and diving into this imaginary world, like that is what actually makes me happy, right? That is the thing that I absolutely live for. It gives me all the joy, all the purpose in the world. And so making sure that I'm doing that and it's my primary focus, and that, everything else is secondary to that is I think, sort of a key for me. In terms of communicating, I've sort of said this to myself, and I'll say it out loud here, so maybe I can hold to it. Like my like plan is I do not want to be a person with a bullhorn standing on a street corner, or like, leading a march on the Capitol, right? Like that's not my shtick. I will show up wherever I'm asked to show up. I will do whatever I can to be helpful in this cause. But in terms of like, forcing myself out into the public sphere, into the conversation, I don't necessarily need that. That is if I feel like it can help somewhere, somehow. But other than that, like, I'm just not interested in being a spokesperson, public face, whatever you want to call it, of anything. I'm too silly for it. It doesn't suit me.
But maybe that's exactly what we need. It's like the modern day version of the court jester who has permission to tell the emperor when he's wearing no clothes.
Yeah, but now everybody wants to do that. So it's like, it's a crowded space, Anyway, sorry.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think there's a lot of people who, no, I'm not going to go down that route. That's just cruel and judgy, even though it holds water. Like, I think that there's a lot of space for people who are, I think, empathetically and intellectually humble enough to realize they take a certain perspective and to make space for being wrong. And I think a lot of conversations that are populating what is becoming a very crowded space just don't hold any humility, or there's a sense of having to project as if one is right and knows everything. And I think that's another issue. I don't know. I want to hear more people ask better questions.
I think you're exactly right. It is one of those things where, you have to like hold in your head, like, okay, everybody's going to come at this from their own angle and with their own set of passions. I do occasionally wish the climate movement had a little more, more variety of tactics in terms of like drawing people in, without necessarily always I don't know. Occasionally the approach, I'm like, if I care about this intensely. I have worked so hard on this issue for so many years, and yet I find everything you're saying to be, not you, but like, my straw man over here. I find everything you're saying, straw man, to be so obnoxious. I just want the planet to fry. Like, that's like, that's not, it's not a good thing to pop in one's head. It's not a good feeling. It's not very charitable or generous, but that is occasionally a thing I felt. So,
but I think the other thing as well, and it really, this is not, I mean, this is becoming a bit of a sort of tell, but like, it's also just, I think we have to be able to have rambunctious conversations. Like, there are so many times when you're stuck in conversations. Well, I don't know, when one encounters conversations where I think people take themselves really seriously, and get offended quite easily. And I just kind of want someone to shake them, be like, it's all right. Let's just have a bit of a shakedown. And it's okay to get offended. It's okay not to know. It's okay to be at the edge of comfort, as long as you're not at actual risk, whether it's, psychological trauma related risk or physical risk. I don't want to diminish these things, but my sense is we have to expand our realm of tolerance for discomfort within ourselves, to be able to take ourselves more lightly, to be able to take the serious things with greater depth and heart and spaciousness. Does that make any sense?
No, of course. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You're like looking quite quizzically at me. Like, I'm just going to tell her it makes sense. Yeah. What's one of the questions or themes that you most despise being asked to engage with?
I like it just in general.
I
always like one of the questions. This is an author question that every author gets, but like, who are your influences? Like, I just
Oh,
think that question is so tedious, and I get it asked it a lot. And now like people are going to listen to this who have asked me that, and I'll feel so guilty for
they can handle it.
having
I'm
said
sure it's
this out
fine.
loud. I just like, like, oh, an author's like journey is such an amalgamation of all of their reading, all of their experience, all of their engagement with media, with culture. And when you're asked to like pluck out a few and try to
Yeah.
explain yourself, it honestly, it feels a little like interrogation-y to me.
Yeah.
And I
Uh-uh.
don't have a clear answer for it. So that's always one that I'm like, oh God, I gotta fucking answer this now. Okay. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
And so I'm wondering then, like, because I'm guessing we're of a similar age. Actually, I don't really Google people's backgrounds too much.
I'm
I prefer
23,
like,
so I'm pretty
oh,
fresh on the yeah.
okay. I'm 22.
The
Funny you should
gray
say
in my
that.
beard. Don't pay attention to that. That's it's a Benjamin Button thing. Don't worry about it.
But I'm wondering. So I've been doing quite a lot of reading around people like James Hollis. Do you know much of James Hollis, like Jungian psychoanalyst? So I'm going to probably completely bastardize this work, but basically, very, very compassionate, smart, interesting guy. Was recently interviewed by one of the bros, Huberman. I don't usually listen to Huberman, but this is an exception because it was James Hollis. I don't think there's many people who listen to him who listen to me. Anyway, it's a small Venn diagram of overlap. But one of the things that I really like about Hollis's work is he talks about this kind of shift that happens perhaps broadly in midlife, where the quest that we have when we're younger in finding our place in society in response to the expectations of others starts to be interrogated. So it's kind of, well,
Mm.
I may have thought that being this kind of person in society was what I was aiming for. And then you start to question who you are, what your values are, what you most profoundly love, either through crises or initiation, which often are intersecting. Um, and I'm kind of curious where you find yourself making meaning at this point in your life, given that you have been in the space for 20 years, which is, you know, I'm guessing you're probably like in your late 30s. But that early stage, moving into a different stage of life, like, where do you find your meaning? Do you feel that that's shifted recently?
Yeah, I mean, this is now
Is
I'm
that okay
like
to
I'm gonna
ask?
have no, I'm gonna have an existential crisis after this because it hasn't shifted
I'm
at
so
all.
sorry.
I'm basically the exact same person I was when I was 23, even probably 15, and
Do you
that's
think?
deeply
Oh, that's so
troubling.
curious. Oh no.
No, I mean, like, look, I spent I spent the first 15 years of my career post college just absolutely frustrated and broke and so pounding my head against the wall because I knew this was what I wanted to do. I knew whatever random Amazon reviewers had to say. I knew I had some talent. Um,
That
and
sounded quite
I knew.
bitter. So go on.
Well, I know, I don't Google myself or go looking for the reviews, but there are people out there that are like, "Fuck this guy, he
Yeah.
sucks." Like
Yeah.
it's like you
No, I
just
get it.
accept that now as a part of life. But no, I mean, it was such a road to get here, to not just sort of hone my craft and work relentlessly at these two. Ohio is not a short novel either. These two really big, ambitious novels. That having finally arrived here, I sort of some days get up and look around and I'm like, oh my God, like I'm living exactly the life I always wanted. Like this is exactly what I wanted to be doing. And if it weren't for the fact that the world's on fire, I would be like, in this absolutely perfect place. Right. So in terms of like what's shifted, the only thing that's shifted is sort of like my ability to sustain myself, financially and sort of like I guess the extrinsic reward, like the recognition part. But I really like, despite like what a jerk I've said on this podcast, I really do try to keep that extrinsic reward system as far away from me as possible. Like I have not read a single review for the Deluge or Ohio. I haven't.
Wow.
I don't go out in search of like the sort of like little pellets of affirmation that are potentially out there. I just try to keep getting up every day, writing something new and exciting, and remembering that like this is the whole reason I did this, so I could like not go to a 9-to-5 job so that I could get up and write every day and have that be my life. And so in that sense, I'm just constantly so grateful that I've managed to get to midlife, although I won't tell you how. To get to midlife and to have this incredible highway in front of me, like just this, I'm on just this awesome journey, this really exciting, interesting time in my life. And just trying to enjoy every minute of it.
Okay. So what do you think are the possible roles for those who are outside of the norm? So you mentioned like not being in the 9-to-5. Most of my friends are artists and musicians. I live in Barcelona and came here on sabbatical to do 3 months of realist painting. Actually, it was the drawing part of the course, and then stayed. And it's been like 7.5 years. And I'm very, very interested in how creative practices, whether one defines oneself as an artist or not, it shows up in many ways, how creative practices can tether us back to this sense of kind of inner richness, one's interiority being a place of beauty and possibility. And as a writer, this is something that I would imagine you're quite familiar with. What do you think is the power in creativity?
Yeah, I mean, you just said it perfectly. That's much more eloquent than I could put it.
Doubt
Yeah. No, I think I am a firm believer that even if you're not writing or painting or creating in order, like it's not going to become a viable career path, which for most people it's not. The act of doing it is the entire reward itself, right? Like I often think about like if I'd never gotten a book published, if I never made a success out of this craft, I would still be doing it for sure. Like without
Really?
question. Absolutely. Like it, I just think like the act of focus, there's that, I'm going to butcher the guy's name, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote a book
Flow.
called Flow and another one called Creativity.
Uh-huh.
And, of course the thesis is that like people say they're happy when they're, buying a new car or having sex or doing this or that or the other. I can't believe that's only 2 examples I could come up with. But they're actually, the most happy when they're in a state of intense focus and concentration, right? On a project, on something that like is giving them that intellectual feedback loop of reward. And that's how I feel all the time, is that like the act of creating, the act of crafting this short story and moving the sentences around and figuring out a better way to describe this suburban tract housing is the fascinating part. That's the project. And so I think the intrinsic rewards of a creative life are so valuable and so precious. And I always encourage people, even if it's not going to be the thing that makes your living, like pursue it anyway. It feels incredible.
What would you say for folks who are, I'm thinking particularly younger people who are raised or have been raised in the culture where these kind of intrinsically motivating creative practices, because a lot of these I remember when I was drawing as a kid, it would be because I was bored or because I was furious at my parents and this is a powerful outlet, or I was lonely and I needed somewhere to place my sadness, and that would be my music. But that there was a spaciousness where I didn't have the option to distract myself, because the only distractions would require effort, like reading a book. It takes a certain amount of dedication to read. And so I'm wondering, with people who are raised in a context in which attention is practically harvested and we're increasingly expected to be always on, available, engaged, responding to the needs of others, social media. For folks who are raised in that context, what are some of the things that you would offer as insights or perhaps even practices that can help? It's probably a really simple question to ask, but like it's such a difficult one.
I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, I'm about as dark on what this is doing to our psychology as anyone. Like, I really think we're only in the early days of understanding just how bad this new culture of the attention economy is going to be psychologically, especially for people who've had to go through their teenage years with it. Um, and, just some simple stuff. I read a book called Deep Work by Cal Newport, which sort of was the
Yeah.
first thing that made me think about my relationship to my phone. Uh, and so now, like when I'm writing, when I'm reading, when I'm watching a movie, even like I'll put it in another room.
Mhm.
It won't be near me. I, remove like most of the distracting stuff on my phone. I turn off all the notifications and I have it on silent all the time. And I know
Oh
some
yeah.
people for their jobs, they can't necessarily do that, but I never have it off of like, not just silent, but like, what's the thing where it doesn't buzz? Do not disturb. That's it.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, and just like maintaining the sense that I am in charge of you, you device, you're not in charge of me, has gone a long way. Because I do think that cultivating, being bored can be an incredibly powerful tool for cultivating imagination, for
Yeah.
cultivating a sense of curiosity about the world, and that those things are incredibly precious. And what's more, they feel better than than scrolling through a bunch of like fucking baby photos and
Oh
people
God.
posting their political opinions and all the rest. I really
Yeah.
think it is this that sense of creativity and imagination in regards to any field, not just like to say writing, that is so wonderful. I've sorry, one more little quick story. My friend out here
Go
is
for it.
a singer songwriter, and she is
Mm.
like not a famous person, but one of the most talented musicians I've ever heard. Right, and we were talking about sort of her practice, and she was like, yeah, one of the problems is like I don't get bored anymore because that's when all my like best song ideas would come up.
Yeah.
Was when I was bored, and now instead of being bored, I'm on Facebook Marketplace like looking for end tables to buy and then trade out. Or I'm scrolling through TikTok pointlessly, or doing something else on my phone,
Mm.
and so I can't cultivate that absent space in my mind in which it starts to play around with stuff, and I get a tune, and then I
Mm.
humming the tune, and then I set a lyric to it, and I'm like, yeah, that's exactly why we need that negative space.
Yeah. And I think there's something about permeability that's kind of, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, this sense that if we are, at some points, we need to be hyper permeable to inspiration to be able to touch us. So whether it's like, I'm also a musician, but it might be walking in the street and you hear someone whistling. And if you are attentive to it, at some point, it might create an entire song. And that's happened to me before. It's like, oh my
Yeah.
God, that's the line. I have to rush home. I put it in my phone or whatever. But if we're not attentive to these things, if we're not permeable in the first place, it can mean that we're living lives that are quite isolated. And the reverse can also be true, that we're so permeable that we are not discerning about what we allow in and what we don't. That you're talking about
Mhm.
having your phone in a separate room, that then our interiority is just crowded by the voices, dreams,
Yeah.
imaginations, homogenized scripts of whatever else is out there, whatever's most dominant. And that's horrendous because then you end up in this kind of monoculture of the mind where
Yep.
nothing exciting is going to flourish because you don't end up with any edge places. Um, yeah.
Yeah, no, I very well put. I couldn't agree more, and I think often people who, for lack of a better word, like sort of live their lives in progressive liberal spaces in big cities, in metropoles, have a certain set of politics and ideas, and don't realize that they too are part of a monoculture.
Right.
Uh, and you know, certainly we can recoil at like a Fox News groupthink without interrogating some of the groupthink that might surround our own spaces, right? Um,
Mhm.
and I definitely have been guilty of that in the past, and it's something I've really tried to like, to keep questioning my assumptions, to keep thinking about where my thinking is faulty, and maintain that idea in the back of one's head that I might be wrong about this.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that's useful not just for like as an intellectual, sort of stance, but also for creating characters who do not share your opinions, which is vital.
Mm. I mean, that in itself being a font of fictional characters. I remember reading years ago, 'cause one of my backgrounds is psychology, that one of the best ways to help um, empathy to flourish in any age, but in particular in young people, is fiction. That's one of the
Oh,
quickest ways
absolutely.
to open people. So we're coming towards the end of the section, and I wonder what are one of the recurring questions or themes that you're living with at the moment, that's present on your mind, whether it's a beautiful one or a panicking one, whatever quality it might have? What's something that's really on your mind at the moment?
uh, yeah, I mean, I'm always sort of processing the world through the scrim of the work I'm doing, the thing I'm writing, right? And I don't like to talk about like necessarily what I'm working on next because I find that can sort of rip the fun out of it a little bit. But after the story collection, I have this, another big novel I'm going to potentially write.
That's a surprise.
And yeah, and
That's
so
amazing.
another decade of my life just vanishing into imaginary people. But I think that now I am trying to think about these times we're living through from potentially a different place than I necessarily inhabit, right? Like I'm trying to think through the ideas of characters who are quite dissimilar to me, and having that long view of history, but like while writing about a very specific moment in time. And anyway, so that's not really a great answer to the question, but I think like that's sort of the way I have tried to manage this struggle over the last, let's say, 8 years of like the rise in a really scary, frightening brand of politics in the West, sort of geopolitical chaos all over the world, and increasing environmental calamity. Is okay. Where are we trying to go? What is the long view of history? What does this look like if we're successful, right? And taking that broad view and then trying to imagine that broad view through the little actions we're taking day to day, if that makes any sense.
I love it. That makes a lot of sense. Do you know the work of Roman Krasnarich? I don't know if I'm
No.
pronouncing his name well. He wrote this wonderful book called The Good Ancestor, and he's just written a new book called The History of Now.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe I'll put you in touch. He's brilliant. Definitely chat with him. And then there's also Rob Hopkins from What Is to What If. It's less about explicitly political models, but it's...
You're like, does this guy actually read? He claims he reads, but he hasn't.
No. No, it's that like, you and I sort of, you're in the States and there's a very different kind of, I'm thinking of the Spanish word tejido. It's like fabric. And so it's quite nice to cross-pollinate. So if you hadn't, then these might be interesting folks to kind of just...
For sure. Yeah.
And
absolutely.
I'm sure they would love to hear about your work. I'm sure they've encountered it already. Okay, well, so I already asked you about hope and beauty. If you were going to ask people to dwell with a particular question, what would it be?
To dwell with a particular question, like what? Dwell with a particular question. I'm sorry, this is like not. I'm not quite ready for this one. I don't think.
So, like, if you were going to give them something to kind of mull over or to think about, maybe it's kind of a core theme from the book or something you're working on now, but like to get people to reflect that might open them up to a different way of being or a different possibility. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just a really silly question.
If I had that, I would definitely be utilizing it more. That sounds like a really powerful question. Yeah, I don't know.
You don't have to have an answer. Maybe you've got a better question.
I don't. I'm sorry. I don't.
What question would you like me to ask to wrap the conversation with? Maybe let's go for that instead.
How can I most quickly find the Deluge? Well, wherever bookstores are sold, their books are sold now. That's the...
All right. And where are the best places to find you? Which is what I was going to end with anyway, but like, let's just zoom right ahead.
Find me. I'm just an author. So you have to actually go out and read the thing. I don't say anything anywhere else. Like occasionally I'll write a little book review for the Times or something, but I think pick up Ohio, pick up the Deluge.
Brilliant. Do it. And you can actually even listen to the Deluge on platforms like Spotify and other places. I was listening to you while refurbishing my house. It's really fun. Well, Stephen, thank you so much. You're an absolute joy to talk to. And I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, thank you. Pleasure was mine.